today we have Andreas Grabner from Dynatrace, and we're going to talk about the 2022 State of SRE report that Dynatrace just published. Andy, welcome. I'll just do a quick introduction. You're a DevOps activist at Dynatrace.
Yeah,
You're calling in from Austria right now. It's great to have you on the show. Welcome.
thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. And then, as we said before, we both share the same heritage, at least geography-wise. And I know you are in San Francisco. I just came back from the States, and but yeah, I'm here. And thanks for having me on the show. It's a great way to educate more people on the
Yeah,
topic.
it's and you may not know this, but I've been following you on Twitter since the mobile days 10 years ago, right? And so
Oh,
I know how you have evolved and always have shared the latest insights as it relates to infrastructure. And then I mean I said it in the beginning. Today the topic is site reliability engineering,
mhm.
and look, there's the report out there. We're going to share the link, and people can go to the Dynatrace website and read it themselves.
Yeah.
What I wanted to talk about today is you just said it. You were in the U.S. for 2 weeks, hosted
Mhm.
workshops. I want to start with a question. What is your definition of site reliability engineering? What does an SRE
Yeah.
do?
Okay, let me, this is my explanation that I have, and
Yeah.
maybe people disagree because they see something else. For me, we have two big groups. On the one side, we have DevOps engineers, and on the other side, we have SREs. And I'm saying side because I see DevOps engineers use automation to speed up delivery.
Mhm.
So using automation to get new changes into production. And then I see SREs, site reliability engineering, to use automation to keep their sites, their production healthy. So
Mhm.
SREs for me are very modern IT operation folks. And I say modern because not that IT ops is old, but in my trip that I just did, I had a lot of organizations where they were all SRE teams, and they said they just changed from being IT operations where they kept care of their servers, their VMs, then moving into the cloud, and now they're kind of tasked to go a level up in the stack and really provide whatever they can and use automation to keep not only their servers healthy, but really keep their apps and services healthy and reliable. And this is also where site reliability engineering comes in. It's really taking automation, taking observability, and making sure that changes that are pushed through from the DevOps teams into production stay in production in a healthy way.
Mhm. Okay. Now, you just said something when you talk. So do those people you said there used to be IT ops, but now they call themselves SREs, and that's because they changed from on-premise to cloud? Is it still the same people, or what has changed?
So, at least again, this is my view of the world. What I've
Mhm.
seen is a lot of the teams that I talked with, they had to level up, not only changing their title, but also now looking into more automation tools, especially as their organizations are either moving towards the cloud
Mhm.
or to what we as an industry call cloud native. And cloud native, by the way, doesn't mean it has to run into the cloud. It's just the way you architect software.
Mhm.
Things become more complex, as we like to say. And in order to tame complexity, you have two options. You can either hire more people to do the same things in a manual way, or you're using smart automation to keep systems resilient and up and running. But not only that, I think this is where I like the intersection between DevOps and SRE so much. I see site reliability engineers also coming out. Some of them are coming out from performance engineering.
Mhm.
I am a big performance engineer myself, or at
Yeah.
least I used to, and that's where I started. So the one track on the one side, SREs, I think, emerge out of operations where IT operations, system admins, they're using more automation. They're moving up the stack, so no longer just responsible for physical machines or virtual machines or Kubernetes clusters. They're really responsible for pretty much everything from the bottom up all the way to the service to the serverless function, just keeping systems reliable.
Mhm.
Um, these teams are then also working very close with the architects to make sure that they are building systems that are resilient by default. What
Mhm.
that means is making sure that these systems that are built are observable, that they consider things like failovers, retries, back-off strategies, right? There's different things how you can, from an architectural perspective, make sure systems are more resilient by default.
Hmm.
And I think this is what I see out there with SREs.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think that nails it, at least from my perspective. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So in your report, in fact, and I think you touched on the evolution, right? Um,
Mhm.
how and in the report you talk about shifting left, right? And I
Mhm.
think in the old world of IT ops, you sort of had, as you mentioned it, right? You had your infrastructure, your machines, and that was it. But how do you see SREs evolving and the shift left
Mhm.
uh, paradigm? Like, what's going on there? Can you talk about that a little bit? What you found in the study and how your customers are thinking about that?
Yeah. So I can tell you the shift left the way I hope it's going to happen.
Hmm.
Um, the way I hope it's going to happen means on the first, SREs need to figure out what does actually success mean in production.
Hmm.
So here we're talking about your SLAs, your service level agreements, also your SLOs is a big topic, service level objectives. And the reason why I differentiate them, there's multiple reasons. I think I have seen a lot of organizations when I asked them, do you have SLAs? And then sure, we have SLAs. We have an SLA where we have to respond to an incident within 24 hours or within an hour. And then I say, yeah, that's kind of from an incident management perspective. Like you are reacting to problems, bringing systems back to a healthy state, and therefore you have an SLA, how fast you bring a system back.
Hmm.
But what I'm talking about is when we talk about SLOs, service level objectives, this is what Google brought into the discussion when they talk about site reliability engineering. What is the definition of an objective to a service you deliver to your end users? Availability, performance, resiliency. So Google talks about the four golden signals that you should monitor and define for your services. Again, how much throughput can it handle? What's the failure rate of a system under high load? What's the latency or response time? And also, what's the saturation of your system under a certain load so that they can do better capacity planning? So I think modern SREs are really thinking beyond how fast can we bring a system back to a healthy state, like how fast can we respond to incidents, towards a model where they say, this is our definition of success. We want to make sure that these systems are up and running and supporting our business goals. And
Hmm.
now here's the magic thing to shift left, I think you can do a couple of things as an SRE.
Hmm.
The first thing is what I mentioned earlier start early, talk with the engineers, with the architects, find out in early testing and early discussions where can systems potentially break and therefore negatively impact your objectives for your business side. So, for instance, you can say, let's do enough load testing, let's do a resiliency testing, let's do chaos engineering to see how your system behaves under chaotic situation. Does it recover automatically? Yes or no? If not, well, then we need to bring in and build in some more resiliency by default. Also, is your system observable? Everybody talks about observability. That's a big topic.
Hmm.
But what does observability mean? Observability can mean something like I can observe that this server is up and running. That's great, but doesn't help you anything. Observability could also mean you're getting your logs, but what if you don't get the right logs? So
Hmm.
observability also means how can we get those metrics, those insights, so we know if systems are running correctly, but not only if they are available and high performing, but also what are leading indicators, meaning, hey, if a developer makes a code change and that code change changes the memory behavior of that app, meaning if I need 50% more memory because they added in a new feature, then I need to account for that. I also need to challenge the developers. Is this really necessary? Because it means the more memory, the more garbage collection, the more garbage collection, the more CPU, the more prone you are to error, the more prone you are to missing your SLOs. So
Hmm.
from a shifting left perspective, um, I think as an SRE, you need to first figure out what are your objectives to the business, right? Available, we need to make money. Then you need to break it down into more technical indicators like, hey, what can I tell my developers? Okay, you have to be, you have to build resiliency into the system. You have to make sure that you're not just making random calls to backend services. They're not just there for fun, but you need to be more efficient.
Hmm.
Be careful about your memory consumption. Be careful about the way you communicate with your database because the database may sit in another continent on a different cloud. So, defining these metrics, defining these indicators, making it observable, and then shifting it left in the delivery pipeline means as a developer, as an architect, I immediately get feedback with every build that I'm pushing through. If with my code change or configuration change, I change any behavior
Hmm.
that would later on negatively impact what the business wants. Right? And so this is what I think shifting left early on, and that includes mentoring, advocating, but putting observability early in the life cycle, investing in automated testing. And with testing here, I mentioned it earlier, I really like the concept of chaos engineering. So
Hmm.
bringing chaos on purpose to systems and then seeing how they react. Um, I also like a term that I think a year or two ago I coined with one of my counterparts at Gremlin. She's a chaos engineer. She used to work for Uber. Her name is Anna Medina.
Hmm.
We said what SREs also need to do. They need to encourage people to do test-driven operations.
Hmm.
So what that means is you want to test drive, meaning through load test and chaos test. As you bring your system into a chaotic situation, does your monitoring work correctly? Do you get the right metrics? Does the monitoring system identify that there is a problem? If so, do the right people get notified? Or if you already have some auto resiliency built in, some auto remediation, does all of this get triggered? So
Hmm.
if you do this before it goes into production, you can be more confident that in case chaos strikes in production, you
Hmm.
have already done your test runs. You know it's not going to be a time where you have to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and then go crazy. Right? I think
Yeah.
these are some of the things.
And the chaos engineering part, I had Dita Matzion on the call. He's at Roku now.
Mhm,
He
mhm,
used to work at Google, and then he worked at Intuit as well. And Intuit, tax software in the United States, we have tax day, and of course, like 95% of the people
mhm.
submit their taxes like on April 15th,
Last day.
2 hours
Yeah.
before midnight, like that type of stuff, right?
Mhm,
And he said when they shifted to the cloud, what they really did is they had a tax day every day internally, right? Like they
mhm,
just tried to simulate that. And
mhm.
it makes all sense of the world because then when tax day comes, you're prepared, right?
Yeah.
Um, but that's a tall order for companies to adopt.
Yeah, 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 it is.
What do you what do companies do in practice to do that? What do you observe? What do you see? And what do you recommend to get there?
Yeah, I think, and I like your analogy, right? Or I like your story with Intuit. I give you an analogy, right?
Hmm.
Because this practice happens in everyday life. Think about our firefighters. The
Hmm.
firefighters are doing test drills every day
Hmm.
because they don't have the chance to just wait for the next big fire, because
Hmm.
if they never exercised on how to drive there and how to get all the hoses and everything there, right, it would be a disaster. So that's why they're also testing. They're simulating bad situations every day.
Hmm. Makes
And
sense.
it's like a muscle, right, that you were training. And this is why it should be just very natural that as IT organizations we do the same thing. I see organizations, and I was just at DevOps Days in Raleigh. So um, one of my cities I visited in the last 2 weeks was Raleigh, North Carolina. I was able to speak at DevOps Days there on our open source project Captain. But one of the speakers, Mandy Wallace, she also talked about the importance of game days. Her talk was actually really cool because she talked about making the unplannable plannable. And she basically said, what is unplannable? Unplannable are situations normally where all of a sudden it's Friday 5 p.m. or Friday 8 o'clock p.m. and something terrible happens, and then this becomes unplanned work, and you work on the weekends, and then it's bad. But you can make it plannable by simply doing whatever it takes to avoid the situation in the first place. So
Hmm.
that's kind of my shifting left, doing more testing up front and also chaos testing, getting the right metrics, validating your observability works, validating that your auto remediation works. That's one thing. But also as you're practicing more, right? Because eventually bad things happen in production and your auto
Yeah.
remediation doesn't fix it. So you will have people on the call. But then if you have been practicing this day in and day out, it just becomes okay, I know what to do. It becomes like muscle memory. And then
Right.
it's very easy to do, right? And doesn't become a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
So I think that was really good from her, kind of planning the unplannable and just doing more things up front. And this is again where SREs come in, because SREs are the ones that should figure out, and I know I repeat myself, but what is the definition of healthy?
Hmm.
right? Because if we're unhealthy, we have to do something. And it's not just, I cannot ping that server anymore. It has to be, we're not delivering based on our objectives we have to our customers or our third party vendors, right? So that's one thing. And then the second thing is they need to then make sure to break these business metrics, business objectives down into, okay, what are technical indicators that if they change as part of my development process, I know this is going to become a problem in production. Like I
Hmm.
brought up you increased memory. Increased memory means more CPU. More CPU means things get slower. Um, More database access means you have more pressure on a depending system. So these are all things that you can validate upfront. And I think this is where SREs play a critical role
Yeah.
in really educating and bringing resilience into the whole delivery pipeline and into the whole life cycle of an application.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the concepts are clear,
Hmm.
but the parties involved, you have the business, you have the developers,
Hmm.
and you have the SREs, right?
Hmm.
And we're going to talk in a bit about what Dynatrace's proposition is in that whole field with your software intelligence platform.
Hmm.
But how do you see the parties? Like, what's the change requirement for the parties? Like, for instance, how does the business, do they have to adopt in terms of understanding what happens at the infrastructure level? What do the developers have to do to understand what the impact of
Hmm.
their code changes? Like, what do you see happening in terms of need for change from a people's
Yeah.
perspective?
So what I've seen in the last 2 weeks, and I told you, I
Hmm.
was very fortunate to visit organizations in different industries, different sizes, different maturity, and we always did an SLO workshop,
Hmm.
SRE workshop, SLO. It was really an SLO workshop because what everybody told me, they understand that SLOs are very important, but they don't have SLOs because nobody tells them what good SLOs are. And this is also reflected in our State of SRE report because 99% of respondents said they understand that SLOs are important, but they have a really hard time defining them. Now, why is that? Why is it so hard to define SLOs? First of all, we're overwhelming people that are new to SRE and SLOs with a lot of advice, right? You need to do this metric and this metric and this metric, like response time, availability, failure rate. You need to define metrics and thresholds on everything. This is impossible if you think about an organization that has hundreds or thousands of services. It doesn't make sense to define a threshold for all of them,
Yeah.
right? Where it makes sense is to sit down with the business first and say, what is our business objective with our new mobile app? So I always
Hmm.
bring the example with a financial customer I worked with last year, and they told me they have a new financial, like a mobile banking app, a new
Hmm.
version of it, because the old one just didn't provide all the new capabilities. They were losing business to the new fintechs that had new cool mobile apps. And so they came up with this new mobile app, developed it for 2 years, and then they said, now we need to define SLOs after 2 years. And I said, first of all, it's a little late after 2 years, but okay, let's figure this out. What's your business objective? And it was summer last year. And they said, well, by the end of the year, we want to have 65% of our user base on the new app. I
Hmm.
said, okay, that's a great top level. So adoption, it's about who adopts the new app versus the old app.
Hmm.
65%. That's easy measurable. My question then back to then was, well, what is keeping you from getting there? Why aren't you already there after 2 years of development? Right? What's the risk?
Hmm.
And they said, well, right now people give us a really bad app rating. We only have a 2-star rating on both Google and Android,
Hmm.
Google and Apple Store. And I said, okay, so basically a leading indicator to app adoption is a better rating. So
Hmm.
let's take the rating as another indicator. Apple and Google, they both provide APIs. We can pull this in, we can put it on a dashboard, and you can see it going.
Hmm.
The next question I asked, so these are two metrics that are important, but you know what? A developer only has minimum impact. They don't really know how to best impact it. Then I asked them, what are people complaining about if they only give you a 2-star rating? The answer was they're complaining mostly about crashes of the mobile app.
Hmm.
So I said, and here we go. Now we have a technical metric that we can also give to the developers and to the testers.
Hmm.
Because if you have the top 10 crashes, the developers can make sure they're fixing those. The testers can make sure The test cases are there. We can also learn from observability about which particular iOSs or Android versions these crashes happen, so we have a better coverage.
Hmm.
Right? And all of a sudden, you have a top level business goal, app adoption, with a leading indicator, which is app rating and the root cause of crashes. Because if you fix the one, it will lead to better rating, and better rating will lead to more adoption.
Yeah.
And then we broke it further down because we said, after, behind every mobile app, there's a strong backend, obviously, because the first thing you do is you need to log in. So we then specified, okay, on these critical services where users are directly interacting with, we clearly need some objectives. We
Hmm.
want to make sure that the login is fast and reliable
Hmm.
under any condition.
Hmm.
And so we specified these goals, and then we took this, we put them on a dashboard in production, so for the business, but then we also communicated that to the engineers to say, you got to write your tests. We need to make sure that performance is great, even under high load. We can test for this. We can even do some chaos engineering to figure out, do you still provide valid responses, even though there's a chaotic situation? So if you cannot longer connect to the database, maybe you have some fallback option. So instead of crashing and responding with an HTTP 500, maybe respond with something that is more meaningful to the front end, where you can give a good error message back to the users, maybe come back later because we're currently under maintenance. So things like this, I think this is hugely important. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 and I mean, look, I used to work for a company that provided crash reporting back in the days. To me, it's surprising that it's still an issue. Like it keeps coming back, and it seems like the business still doesn't
Mm.
understand the importance of these things.
Mm.
Um, okay, but on that journey that you just explained, right? So now they understand the metrics, how you come from a business goal all the way down to a technical metric. And hold on, and actually, I wanted to share this graph from your report. I'm going to do this right now here. A tab, tab right here, the report, and um, it's the BAS adoption curve. That's the concept, right? And the question here
Mm.
is like, what stage is the site reliability engineering journey? At what stage is your organization currently, right? And you have the four
Mm.
stages: immature, emerging, maturing, and advanced. And
Mm.
um, in your view, what are the steps sort of that companies have to take to get there? And in your example, I would probably say they were probably in the emerging bucket. I don't know how you see that, but what is
Mm.
your recommendation? Like, how can people go through this journey? Because obviously everybody wants to be advanced, right? Like, what do
Mm.
they need to do to get there?
So I think it comes back to the same thing that I said, because
Hmm.
if you don't know what your top level goal is, then you see things like, I remember one conversation I had last week, and I really like this guy. He's been, in our community for many years, and he showed me all the cool things he's been doing on performance testing and performance engineering. And then I asked him, why are you doing this? And he said, well, because I'm a performance engineer and I'm optimizing my system. And I said, that's
Hmm.
great, but why are you optimizing here and not somewhere else? He said, well, because that's my call. And I said, so you don't even know where you should focus your time on to actually have the biggest impact to the business, which means you're just running around and being busy without focusing the time that you have to really work on what has the biggest impact. And again, it comes back to that typically what I see, there's a big gap between the business needs and what's technically being implemented. And
Hmm.
it's not that the business doesn't have the need, but if they don't explain well enough, if they don't work together and figure out these are my business objectives, and therefore everything you do as an SRE, everything the development does should be aligned with what makes us money in the end, or makes our business thrive, right? Whether it's money or whatever the business does.
Yeah.
But the point is, you need to figure out, if you spend, if you work 40 hours a week, then you should spend it that it has the most impact to the business goal. And this is why, kind of like, if you think about the pyramid, right, on the top you have some business level objectives, and then you
Hmm.
need to break it down, and you want to make sure you're spending most of your time that supports the business. It's also with, like, the same with OKRs, objective key results,
Hmm.
or whatever you call it in your organization, KPIs.
Hmm.
If you don't know what your top level business goals are and how you're actually contributing to them, then obviously then you feel, then you're just, you're doing things all the time and you feel like you're overwhelmed and you don't really know what impact you have, and then you are, I think, not focusing the time that you have on the right things.
Yeah.
And this is why you're feeling like you're being trapped in this. We're starting this new thing on SRE and we're kind of like just getting started, but we feel like we're not mature. Of course you're not mature because you're not focusing on the right things, which means it takes you longer to actually get into this
Yeah.
adoption phase.
Interesting. Yeah. And in this whole process, what role do developers play? Because one thing I've observed is that everyone wants to give developers liberal permissions. They can do whatever they want, all for the sake of
Mm,
shipping more software and running more experiments, right?
mm,
But we all know that breaks at some point, that model, right?
mm,
Um, what do you see has to change on the developer side in terms of understanding how infrastructure works and architecture and all of that? Like, what needs to change?
mm. So first of all, maybe we should be a little more specific on what we mean with developer, because it's not necessarily the individual
Hmm.
developer. I think we talk about development teams
Hmm.
that are building, some service, some application, or whatever it is. I don't necessarily think every developer needs to understand the underlyings of the architecture where the things run.
Hmm.
Unless you're a small startup and you have to do pretty much everything, then it makes sense. And I think it's a great learning curve if you actually know what's happening behind the scenes and why it is expensive to run software, because there's actually physical hardware underneath. Um, but in these larger organizations, at least that I work with, what the SRE team is doing, they're working, and I'm giving you yet another term. They're working with the DevOps team, and with the DevOps team, I mean these are the teams that are ensuring the delivery pipeline. So they are the ones that are working on Jenkins, on GitLab, on all these tools, and what they are basically providing, as they are providing different steps for the pipeline, they're working with them to get observability
Hmm.
into the stuff that they're pushing, that they are automatically executing the tests.
Hmm.
And because if you do this, if you bake this into the pipeline and you're pushing this data back to the developers that actually write the code into their tools where they live and breathe, that might be Visual Studio Code, this might be any other tool that they're using. But if you do that, as a developer, I immediately get feedback. Oh, this code change just introduced a new vulnerability. Well, thanks God, we have automated application security built in. Oh, this code change is now increasing memory by 50%. Thank you, DevOps team, for automatically executing some basic level of tests and also giving me the visibility into my memory behavior. Oh, look at this. This code change is now including a new dependency I wasn't even aware of because I'm now calling a different service.
Hmm.
And these are things, but I don't necessarily need to know where this stuff runs, because I think the SRE teams and the DevOps teams that are building kind of the pipeline and the platform, they should take care of building this in as platform features
Hmm.
so that the developers can really focus on pushing more code through. But because everything is automatically checked and tested and validated, they also get feedback in case the developer made a change that has a potential negative impact.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. So you mentioned something, feeding data back into the systems where development teams operate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think, can we talk about the sheer amount of data that's being
Mm-hmm.
generated?
Yeah.
And I think that's also where Dynatrace has a strong positioning, like just capturing
Yeah.
and that data. But let's
Yeah.
talk about the data. What's the data set companies need to look at? How do they get it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
how do they make it useful? Because we're talking, I mean, no human can process the amount of data that a mobile app generates or any type of service. Like, what's your experience
Exactly.
there?
Yeah. So I completely agree with you. We cannot overwhelm people with more data they can handle anyway. And also, if that's not their primary job to analyze this type
Mhm.
of data, then I think we also make them frustrated and kind of take away the time of what they should really do. And this is where tools like ours come in, right? So what we are doing, and I've been with the company for 14 years, and the company has been around for even a little bit longer than that. But what we have always been doing is observing, right?
Mhm.
So we've always captured a lot of data. Data in context, I think this is very important. So one of the things that and one of the reasons why I'm still here at Dynatrace after that many years and so happy, is because Dynatrace, and it's in its name, Dynatrace, dynamic tracing. So we've been doing distributed tracing since the beginning of the company, and this actually, the dynamic tracing allows us to not only collect individual pieces of data like a memory metric here and a response time metric here and a CPU metric here. We have all the data in context.
Mhm.
And I think modern observability platforms, so we call ourselves a software intelligence platform, is not only dumping you with a lot of data, what we do, because we have a lot of data in context and because we also have a lot of experience on how you would analyze data and detect problems. We not only dump a lot of data back to the developer, but we tell the developer, by the way, there's an issue that this code change introduces where you are running into a performance issue, in a resiliency issue. You're
Mhm.
making 50% more database calls than before. How do we know this? Because we've baselined your system. We know how your system normally runs, and we know if you increase the number of database calls, then you will run into an issue. Or if you increase your memory footprint because you're keeping too much cache in
Mhm.
memory, then you have two options. You can either scale up the cache, or you need to figure out a way how to be better with caching, because otherwise you run into garbage collection and so on and so forth. So our thing is not giving you just more data that nobody can handle, but really give you answers and hints about answers on if there's a problem, why there's a problem, what's the root cause, and also optimization hints like, hey, this is where you need to optimize, but not somewhere else. Or, you're perfectly fine right now. No need to look at any data. Keep coding. You're actually doing a good job.
Hmm.
And then this comes back to pushing it into their tools. Don't bring people to the data, bring the answers to the people when they need it.
When they need it.
And the
Yeah.
right data at the right time, or the right answers at the right time, to the right people or tool to make the right next decision.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Perfect. The one thing we didn't talk about here so far, or haven't talked about yet, is the security aspect. And I
Mm-hmm.
think your report touches on that. Um, how do people have, I mean, how do your customers, how do they think about security these days? And when does the security perspective come into the conversation, at what point?
Well, I think security is more on everybody's mind than ever before, right?
Yeah.
I guess we don't need to remind ourselves what happened in the last couple of months.
Yeah.
And I think this also, why as painful as it was also a good thing, because now these SREs again and DevOps teams are really trying to figure out how can we automate security checks early on, because there are certain security checks that you can do as part of a deployment, or as part of a build process of your testing process, right? You can do static code analysis, you can do analysis on which libraries get loaded. So there's certain things where you can automatically say, hey, something is wrong here. That's not a good thing. On the other side, not every vulnerability is known at the time of building and deploying. Some vulnerabilities like Log4Shell and
Yeah.
Log4j, right? They were detected later on. So this is also why it's very important that you have dynamic security scanning in production, because
Hmm.
at the point when Log4Shell hit, you need to know immediately, are we vulnerable, and if so, is this a real threat or not? And with a real threat, I mean, just because you have a Log4Shell library laying around on one of your temp folders doesn't make your system vulnerable. So what you really need to know is, does the vulnerable library get loaded? Is it actually executed?
Hmm.
And the system where it runs, is it potentially exposed, or is it exposed to the internet, to an external attacker?
Hmm.
And also, does it have access to sensitive data? Because these are kind of the dimensions of what you need to consider once you start attacking these problems. Because if you have, and I noticed from another customer, they basically, when Log4Shell happened, they stopped all of the engineers working on that they worked on their stuff. They said, all you do now is you go through all the source code and remove every single reference to Log4Shell. And so they were basically they had like 200 developers doing nothing else for 1 week of just fixing things.
Oh God.
But this approach, right, it's doable just throwing people at the problem.
Yeah.
But our approach, and this is also what Dynatrace does, we have an AppSec capability, so application security capability, where we dynamically and automatically detect vulnerabilities.
Hmm.
But not only if you have a vulnerability, but we also tell you, hey, yes, you have 100 services that have log4shell, but you know what? Only 10 of those are exposed to the internet, and two of those also have access to sensitive data in a database. So our recommendation is, and this comes back to, we give you answers and direction instead of just data.
Hmm.
Because instead of telling you, here are 1,000 things you need to fix, we say these two first because they have the highest vulnerability and highest risk. Then these eight, and then you can think of if you want to tackle the other ones, but they're not really necessary because these are all backend system. Nobody has access to it anyway.
Makes
And I
sense.
think this is, again, security has to be, on our minds. It is on our minds, but we have to be very smart because you cannot hunt down every single vulnerability. You have to be smart. And this
Yeah.
is where Dynatrace software intelligence comes in, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, people can go to your website, right? And I think the
Mhm.
logos of your customers speak for themselves. Who's using
Yeah.
Dynatrace? Um, and okay, so we covered reliability, we covered resilience, we covered security. Um, Now, this all comes back and falls on the shoulders of the SREs at the end of the day, right? So that's a lot they have to do.
I mean, it's not only the SRE. I think it's the whole organization that is providing these platforms. I think some of that falls into the, and again, whatever role it is, however you call it in your organization, right?
Yeah.
But clearly, in the SREs have a big part of the work here. But what they need to do is they need to enable the teams that are building these pipelines, the DevOps teams, and therefore also the individual development teams, with observability, with automated insights, and not just
Mhm.
more data with observability, but really smart insights. Also coaching. I think coaching is a big thing. Mentoring, what I mentioned in the very beginning. Um, Resilient systems, you cannot just buy resiliency as a service. There's no Amazon or Google service where you can say, boom, and now my system that crashed all the time is all of a sudden resilient. This is stuff that needs to be architectured in.
Mhm.
So it's also great for SREs to mentor and work closely with the architects to make the right architectural decisions so that systems are observable by default, that they're resilient by default. Things like when in the Kubernetes world, what I constantly see, Kubernetes itself is a great platform that has built-in resiliency checks.
Mhm.
For instance, you can on your container, you have your health endpoints, but if you have not specified them, then it doesn't. Kubernetes cannot properly figure out if your pod is healthy. Proper sizing, right? I mean, there's so many things, your limits that you need to set. Don't go with defaults. Really figure out, what makes sense for the type of application. And these are things
Defaults.
that once people start doing that, I think systems will become more resilient by default, and therefore the job of the SRE will also become easier.
Yeah, you just said one thing that I hear a lot of times: default settings of all these cloud services. Very
Mm,
dangerous, right? If you don't know how the service works, dealing with it. So that's why education is so important, right? Like
yeah,
understand the services you're deploying. That's like step number one. Uh,
exactly.
Andy, to close up the discussion now, as a company now, and maybe as a business or engineering leader, I'm clear about the concepts, I'm clear about the goals, and now I need to go out and hire SREs. What do you see successful companies do to attract great SREs? Because there's more demand and there are people right now in the
Mm,
market, right? And so they can pick.
mm.
Like, what do you see those companies do that hire the best talent?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's really challenging to hire talent because it's a very demanding market, as we know. It's very
Yeah,
hard to find people that actually want to change. I think just throwing money at people doesn't help. You're just going to attract a lot of people that just do it for the money, and then they will just move to another company if they get a better offer. I think
yeah,
that's just an unfortunate situation we live in. I think what's more important is that you give them a field where you can actually learn on the job, where you can become better. So not just asking people for, you do your job, you do your job, but also, hey, in your job, we don't expect you to be perfect. We give you the room to actually become an SRE and become then a better SRE. So things like, dedicated time for education, sending them to conferences, having exchanges with other people. What I see a lot, and I think successful companies do, and this now goes out to every a communication team in any large organization: let your people talk about the stuff that they're doing internally,
Yeah.
and don't think they're giving away secrets.
Yeah.
Because if you have, take financial organizations, if you keep them behind doors, then nobody actually knows what cool stuff they're working on. So
Yeah.
let them go out there, speak at meetups, present at conferences, because this is a great way to actually attract new talent. And not just because of the money you pay them, but because they already know you're working. Actually, yes, you're working on some mainframe stuff because that's still there, but you're actually building some cool stuff on top of it. And I think this is, so let people speak out about it publicly, what they do, and don't be afraid. It just helps you.
I think that's one of the best recommendations ever. Too many times, great content has been blocked by comms and PR
Yeah,
for the wrong reasons. I think
yeah,
great engineering talks attract great engineers, right? I mean, it's just
yeah,
as easy as that. Yeah.
yeah. I
Um,
mean, if we look at what Netflix has been doing, or Uber, right? I mean, they were, I mean, obviously they do great stuff and everybody knows about it. And 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 even though they reveal how they build their observability and their chaos, how they're using chaos engineering, it's they're just, this is why they're getting even more attractive to work there.
yeah, yeah. There's a reason why they attract the best talent, right?
Yeah.
Andy, how can people reach you when they want to follow up, learn more about the report and also about Dynatrace? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think the best way is LinkedIn or Twitter. If you're not on Twitter, but if you are on Twitter, it's Grabner Andy. So my last name and then ANDI, and Andy with an I.
Yeah.
The other one is LinkedIn. I think is a good way for most people who are on LinkedIn to just connect. Yeah,
Hmm.
perfect.
Perfect. That's you. I'm
Exactly.
sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And from there you find the rest. Yeah, I have my podcast. I have my YouTube channel. I'm also very active in the with the open source project Captain,
Hmm.
which is a project that Dynatrace donated to the CNCF.
Hmm.
And yeah,
Maybe that's a good topic for another podcast. We will do a follow up on this one.
yeah.
Fantastic. Andy, thank you so much. Um, we're going to ship this version along with the link to the report. And then the next one we just schedule and talk about Captain. But this has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
Tschüss.
Tschüss. Servus.